My name does not matter. Neither does my face. What matters is that I was part of Los Zetas in the hardest years, when the whole country trembled just hearing our name. And everyone believed Lazca was the real boss. But that was always the big lie. Because even though he appeared in corridos and newspapers, I saw with my own eyes that even he obeyed orders from someone else. Someone who never showed up in the news but had absolute control. I realized it from my very first days when I was just a lookout in Nuevo Laredo. They gave me an old radio and a notebook to write down license plates. They told me that if my tongue slipped or if I fell asleep, the punishment would not be a scolding, but an execution. That was the atmosphere. Military discipline disguised as crime. Because Los Zetas were born from army deserters, and they carried that mentality tattooed on their skin. No improvising. Everything was order. Uniforms, schedules, codes. I was barely 19 and already living like I was in a barracks, afraid to even breathe too loud. That is when I first heard the name that would haunt me for life. They called him El Notario. Not because he signed papers, but because nothing moved without his approval. A ghost in a suit who spoke little but decided everything. I did not meet him in person at first. I just heard him in whispers and cut off phrases over the radios, in orders coming from above signed with 3 initials. And every time his name appeared, even the most violent men lowered their eyes. One night, I understood exactly what that meant. We were in a safe house in Colonia Madero. Big meeting. Commanders came in armed, plaza bosses, and even El Lazca himself. The atmosphere was tense. They had lost a load at the border, and punishment had to be given. Everyone expected Lazca to explode with his cold temper. That man who never hesitated to order executions with the same calmness he would ask for a coffee. He gave the order to take 2 commanders who had failed. But before confirming it, he asked for a call. Total silence. The satellite phone buzzed, and on the other end was a different voice. Calm, polite, almost gentle, like some lawyer. He spoke for just a few seconds, and in an instant the decision changed. Do not take them. Move them to Reynosa. Freeze payments. Change the routes. Those were the instructions. Nobody dared to argue, not even Lazca. Everyone just replied, "Yes, sir. Understood, sir." And I was frozen, because that was the moment it hit me. The man the press called boss was just the face. The real power was somewhere else, in an office with no windows, where someone moved the pieces like we were soldiers on a chessboard. From then on, I started noticing the details. The maps hung in warehouses with routes that changed overnight depending on orders from that ghost. The payroll sheets that arrived with coded initials, untouched until his signature appeared. The envelopes sent from Monterrey to Tamaulipas with handwritten corrections. I understood that this man they called El Notario did not need a rifle or corridos. His weapon was absolute control. The plaza bosses feared him more than the DEA or the Army, because they knew a mistake was not paid with prison. It was paid with disappearance. I saw it in my first months. A buddy who fell asleep during his watch showed up 2 days later hanging from a bridge with a sign that read, "Discipline comes first." That phrase became our Bible, and no one ever questioned it, because we all knew it came from him, the real boss, the one even El Lazca obeyed in silence. With the months, I moved up in rank. I was no longer just a lookout with a radio. They started giving me heavier tasks, first as a driver, then as security, and later as part of a small trusted group that moved big loads. It was in those jobs where I first heard the notary's voice directly. It was not like the shouts of a commander in the middle of a shootout, nor like the sharp orders of Lazca. It was a soft voice, calm and measured, with words that sounded more like an office than a sicario. Yet every syllable was law. I remember the first time they spoke of him seriously. We were in a warehouse in San Fernando after a failed operation. The shipment had not arrived complete, and everyone knew heads could roll. Suddenly, one of the commanders got a call. He put it on speaker, and there it was, that calm voice saying that no one was to move a finger until he reviewed it. Everyone, even the bravest, fell silent. Nobody dared to argue. It was like the air froze, and I realized that this man I had never seen could decide our lives with a single phone call. Soon I understood that he did not just control shipments. He also controlled the payroll, the contacts with politicians, and even the movements of weapons. Some said he had been a high-ranking military officer. Others said he had studied law. That is why they called him the notary. I never confirmed anything, but what I do know is that his intelligence was as cold as it was lethal. While Lazca appeared in corridos and in the sights of the army, the real brain was hidden among desks and papers. From there, he decided which commander stayed and which disappeared. More than once, I saw a boss who seemed untouchable fall overnight by orders signed with his initials, and everyone understood the message. In Los Zetas, there was no room for improvisation. Discipline was stronger than loyalty, and that discipline came from above, from a ghost who never fired a gun but killed more than anyone. One night in Reynosa, I saw something that marked me. We arrived at a ranch for a meeting. I was part of the security and stayed at the door. Inside, several plaza bosses were arguing over routes and territories. There were shouts and insults, and it looked like it would end in a shootout between our own people. Then they put a call on speaker. The notary's voice came in calm, and in seconds, all those men who were cursing each other lowered their heads and listened like students in front of a teacher. He gave a few instructions, set a payment calendar, corrected routes, and finally said, "Do it right." Total silence. Then they all stood up as if nothing had happened. They toasted and left. I was frozen because I understood that not even the bloodiest bosses owned their decisions. There was someone above moving the strings as if we were chess pieces. What shook me the most was how he never appeared in photos, never in meetings, never in operations. It was like a myth that still left marks on every move. Once I had to deliver a briefcase to Monterey. It was bundles of dollars. They told me to drop it off at an office downtown. When I arrived, it looked like a law firm. People in suits, desks with papers and computers. No rifles, no tattooed sicarios. That is when I understood the business was not just blood. It was also administration and numbers. And that this man, the notary, moved in that untouchable world while we spilled our blood in the streets. That was the first time I wondered if we were really soldiers of a cartel or employees of a criminal company run by someone who would never dirty his hands. With time, I understood that what kept Los Zetas standing was not only the violence or the long guns. It was the iron discipline that came from above, the rules of steel that the notary had imposed like commandments carved in stone. And those rules were not negotiable. Anyone who dared to break them signed their own death sentence. One of the clearest was that nobody could move a finger without authorization. It did not matter if you were a lookout or a plaza boss. Any operation, any collection, any hit had to be approved. There were those who got impatient and thought the best way to grow was to act ahead. But I saw what happened to one who tried. They called him the Coyote, a veteran hitman who thought he had the confidence to order a kidnapping on his own. He caught a rival and made him talk. It looked like everything had gone well until the notary found out. That same week they summoned him to a meeting, and in front of everyone he was accused of breaking discipline. He tried to justify himself saying he did it for the good of the plaza, but the sentence was already written. They put a bullet in his forehead right there and made us all look at his body as a reminder. Discipline is above initiative. That was the lesson no one ever forgot. Another sacred rule was silence. What was seen, what was done, and what was heard stayed inside. No family, no friends, no drunk talk. I saw how a compañero who bragged too much at a party ended up hanging from a bridge with a sign that said, "Those who talk too much do not last." And we all knew that order had not come from an angry commander, but from the notary himself, because he had ordered those words to be printed on the cardboard. It was his way of keeping psychological control. Each execution was not only a punishment, but also a message that echoed in all of us. And that is how fear became the religion of the group. Nobody wanted to be the next example. What impressed me most was how those rules were calculated to keep us always on edge, even in personal matters. There were rules about drug use, about drinking, about women. You could have your private life, but if you crossed the line, the punishment was immediate. I remember a guy called El Güero who got involved with the wife of a commander. When it came out, they tied him in a warehouse and forced him to beg forgiveness before executing him. The strange part is that the notary himself was on that call. I heard it. He said cold words. Passions break discipline, and discipline is the only thing that keeps this army alive. I still get chills because it was like hearing an invisible general who never appeared on the ground, but decided who deserved to die for a mistake that others might see as insignificant. I myself was close to falling into one of those traps. One day I was ordered to watch over a group of new lookouts. They were kids just starting in the business. One of them recognized me. He was from my neighborhood. I knew him from school. He asked me to help him because he could not handle the pressure. He begged me to tell him how to get out. And for a moment I thought about helping him. But I knew that even hearing those words was dangerous, because if I reported them as a confession, I could save myself. But if I stayed quiet, I ran the risk of being accused of covering for him. I spent nights with the dilemma. In the end, I did not snitch, but the kid disappeared a week later. Surely someone else reported him. And I understood that even thoughts were dangerous in a place where discipline was applied like a knife. The notary never appeared, but it was as if he watched us day and night with eyes everywhere, and that fear was stronger than any bullet. The war against other cartels seemed chaotic from the outside, but inside you understood that every move was calculated, and that the real strategist was not Lazca or the commanders yelling at us in the operations. It was that ghost we called the notary. He was the one who decided when to attack, when to retreat, and even which zones were better left alone so the plaza would not get too hot. I remember an operation in Veracruz where we had 20 trucks ready to wipe out a rival cell. We all had orders to advance, but halfway through came a coded message. Everything was canceled. We were sent to wait at a specific point. Tempers flared because we were already prepared for war, but hours later army convoys arrived and did the dirty work. They crushed the rival cell and then pulled out. The next day we went in to secure the area without firing a shot. That was when I understood the notary had direct communication with military commanders, and he used those connections to manipulate the war like a strategy board where he never risked anything, and we were the pieces to be sacrificed. The same thing happened with politics. I saw mayors, deputies, and even governors parade through ranches where deals were closed with a glass of wine and a handshake, but always under conditions dictated from above. Once I heard a municipal president beg to be left alone because he wanted to keep things clean. He walked out of the meeting smiling with a new truck and promises of protection. But weeks later, he was executed for trying to back out of the deal. Nobody said anything, But everyone knew that order had come with the notary's signature. He had no patience for broken pacts, and politicians learned it was better to obey a ghost than the voters who had elected them. What surprised me most was the coldness with which he handled everything. While we were covered in blood and gunpowder, he was in air-conditioned offices receiving reports, maps, aerial photos, and financial statements. Because what really mattered to him were the numbers. How much came in, how much went out, and how much was laundered. I went several times to deliver briefcases to places that looked like legal businesses, real estate offices, construction companies, law firms. All of it was a front. And in each delivery, someone mentioned the notary as if he were the general director of a multinational company, with the difference that here meetings closed with corpses instead of contracts. But not everything was coldness. Sometimes there were calculated messages to keep us in line. I remember during the war against the Gulf, they sent us to Tamaulipas to reinforce a plaza. The battle was brutal. Entire streets filled with shells and houses riddled with bullets. In the end, we gained ground, but with many losses. We were exhausted and demoralized, and at that moment a sealed package arrived with the notary's mark. It was an envelope with bills for each of us and a typed letter that said, "Discipline hurts, but guarantees victory. Stay firm." It was not an inspiring phrase like a politician. It was dry, almost military, but it had an effect. We all felt that someone up there knew about us, that we were not just cannon fodder, and we went back to fight with more rage than before, because deep down we wanted to prove we were soldiers worthy of the discipline he imposed. It was in that time when I faced the hardest order of my life. Until then, I had seen many die. Rivals, traitors, lookouts who fell asleep, people I barely knew. But one thing was to obey, and another very different was to stain my hands with someone who had been my brother in everything but blood. They called him Chino, and we had started together as lookouts in Nuevo Laredo. We shared radios, fear, and dreams that one day we would get out of that hell. But he made a mistake that the notary would never forgive. He kept money from a delivery. People said it was little compared to what we moved every week, but the money didn't matter. What mattered was the broken discipline. Someone reported him, and in less than 2 days, his sentence was written. He would be executed, and the order came down with my name as the one who had to do it. I had to prove my loyalty. When they told me, I felt my blood freeze. I thought about begging, asking someone else to do it, but I knew that would only put me on the same list. We took him to a warehouse on the outskirts of Monterey. It was night and cold. Chino was tied up, and I had him in front of me. He looked at me without hate, more with resignation, as if he already knew nothing could save him. He told me not to do it, that he knew I was not like that I still had some heart. And I could only grit my teeth because the eyes of the others burned on the back of my neck. If I hesitated a second, they would blow my head off with his. The notary was not there, but all of us felt his presence as if he were watching us through those cameras he had ordered installed everywhere. In the end, I had no choice. I pulled the trigger, and his body fell like a sack. The silence that followed was worse than the shots, because in my head his words echoed. "I knew you were not like this." And that phrase followed me like a ghost I still hear in my dreams. After that, nothing was the same. I understood that in that world, brotherhood meant nothing compared to blind loyalty to an invisible boss. We had been turned into replaceable pieces of a perfect machine of fear and blood. And the worst part was that I no longer knew if I acted by will or by pure inertia. Everything I did was following rules already tattooed in my soul. I moved like a robot, killed without asking, collected without thinking, obeyed without feeling, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Chino's face with that resignation that reminded me I had crossed a line from which I would never return. That was the first time I seriously thought about escaping, because I knew sooner or later it would be my turn. It didn't matter how much I obeyed, how much fear I showed, or how many orders I fulfilled. The notary always found reasons to clean the house, and I knew too much. I had been in meetings, seen faces, heard voices. I had become an uncomfortable witness, and witnesses in that organization did not last. I started hiding money in double bottoms of backpacks, getting false documents, and studying escape routes. But every move felt like slow suicide, because I knew the notary had eyes everywhere. And the same discipline that kept everything standing was the one chaining me to a destiny from which it seemed impossible to escape. When I finally decided to escape, it was no longer out of fear, but out of survival instinct. I knew that sooner or later the notary would erase me, because I had been too close to his shadow. I had seen things few had seen, heard voices few had heard, and in that organization, anyone who knew too much ended up in an unmarked grave. I hid money in double bottoms of suitcases, got false passports through a contact in Monterey, and planned everything in detail. The escape would be at dawn through a stretch of border that was barely guarded. I had rehearsed every move in my head for weeks, but inside I felt that someone already knew, as if every step I took was written in a notebook he had in front of him. The night of the escape, I drove an old truck that did not draw attention, documents hidden under the seat, and a gun at my waist. Every kilometer felt eternal. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would break my chest. In the distance, I saw shadows and thought they were lookouts following me. When I reached the crossing point, everything seemed quiet. The coyote signaled me, and I hid inside a secret compartment of a trailer loaded with appliances. I thought I had finally made it, that by sunrise I would be breathing another air. But as soon as the compartment closed, I heard a voice that froze my blood. It was the driver whispering on the radio, a single phrase, "The Judas is inside." In that instant, I knew it was over. Someone had sold me, or maybe the notary had foreseen my move from the very start. I do not remember how much time passed in that darkness. I only know the trailer stopped, and instead of freedom, I felt rifle butts breaking the door. They dragged me out with my face covered and took me to a warehouse lit by yellow lights. And in front of me, like a specter I had never seen but always felt, was him, the notary. Not with boots or rifles, but with a dark suit, a tie, and a calmness that hurt more than any scream. He looked at me like he had known me since I was a child. He said my full name, mentioned my family, even remembered details I had only shared in confidence with friends. It was as if he had access to my whole life. He told me he was not angry, that he understood, that sometimes soldiers get tired of war, but that I had to choose. He put in front of me two options: an envelope full of money and a new passport with a clean identity, or a loaded pistol. He said in this world there was no desertion, only reintegration or death, and that my destiny depended on how much courage I had to accept the truth. I was trembling, unable to speak, only staring at him while his eyes seemed to read my soul. In the end, I did not have to choose. He himself took the passport, put it in my pocket, and told me, "You are already dead for Los Zetas. Now you are someone else. Leave and do not look back. But remember, I let you go. And that means your life will always belong to me, even if you breathe in another country." Those words broke me more than if he had executed me, because I understood he was not giving me freedom. He was condemning me to live under his shadow forever. I managed to get out. I crossed. I hid. I changed my name and my city. But even today, every time I hear a phone ring, I think it is him. Every time I see a man in a black tie on the street, I wonder if he is coming for me. Because the real boss was never El Lazca. He was only the face, the monster in the newspapers, the terror in the corridos. But the true chief, the one who wrote the rules and decided life or death with a whisper, never appeared in the press. And he is still alive. hidden in offices that look untouchable, running the business like a multinational of blood and money. And I am just a shadow trying to escape from something you cannot escape, because from bullets you can run, but from the fear planted by a ghost in a suit you never break free, not in this life and not in the next.